Hack40. Yes.
So if you know anyone that expertise could help Japanese startup go global outside of what I've just mentioned, then we're happy to have partnership with them and have them as instructors in the platform. So we're looking for instructors. So actually you start with minus 12 points, minus 15 points, and that's totally normal. And actually when people come to Japan, they also start with minus 15 points. So to go against that, you need to make extra effort to look more trustworthy.
Okay, let's get started. Okay. Hi, Sofian. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you today?
So it's Sakura season, cherry blossom season in Tokyo. And here is a most famous tech conference in Tokyo, Take Off Tokyo 2025. So, Sofian, tell us about yourself. What do you do in Tokyo?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm Sofian. I'm a French entrepreneur. Super happy to be in Tokyo. This event, Take Off Tokyo, is kind of a global event for people to connect. What I'm looking for, I'm actually running a startup accelerator called Hack40, and we operate in Paris, Singapore, Seoul, and recently Tokyo.
Hack40, yes.
So we have some programs from, let's say, other countries who wants to go into Japan or from Japan to the world. And my goal is to develop more partnerships to make sure we can always provide the best services to the startups in terms of anything they need to know to make a first contract in a new market.
I see. Thank you. Let's dive into Hack40. So why 40?
There is a reason why. So in France, the stock exchange, it's called CAC40. So basically the top 40 biggest company in France are inside. So with my co-founder, when we started the company 10 years ago, we thought our goal is to hack all of those companies one by one and bring them the startup mindset. So we created Hack40. Combination of hack and CAC40.
I see. So 10 years ago, you and your co-founder started to a Hack40. Amazing. Okay, this year is 10 years anniversary.
Yes.
Congratulations.
So you can define it as a global startup accelerator, which means that we run programs for startups from Korea, from Singapore, and now from Japan to understand a new market. So we do market research, give them like the trends, competition, what they need to know about the regulations, and who they need to meet. Then we do trainings, like we help them refine their proposition with what they know about the new market. They need to be different to have a specific approach on their price, on their product. So they need to change the sales presentation to prepare for the meetings, to make a good proposal for their prospects in this new market, and to show that they have a real global strategy. Let's say a startup from Japan wants to go to Singapore. They need to explain to any prospect they meet why Singapore, why does it make sense. Basically that they did the homework and that all makes sense. Then we organize business meetings and matching with potential customers. We have a partner, 50 global partners.
50?
Yes, like the really big company in Singapore, in Europe and US, open to collaborate with startups from Asia. And so introduction, running meetings, and eventually get what we call a POC, so proof of concept, which is like a first project with a company that you basically want to show your value without having a full sales process, just a small test to show that your product is a good fit for this client. And once you have that, then you build trust, you learn about the market, and eventually you can say, okay, now it's time to really put investment to sell in this new market. Basically testing the market fit with a global strategy.
I see. Yeah. Okay, so as a Japanese, there are many potential founders. How can we apply for your program?
So our programs work as government-funded programs. So for Singapore, we are official partner for Paris. For Korea, we work with many different government agencies. As for Japan, we are launching new programs this year. So what happened is some startups come to me and say, oh, how can we apply? So because it depends on government agency programs, then I will point out the program of the year. But to be able to open up to more founders, I founded this year actually a new project called Outcost. That is a platform.
Is this?
It's this one, yeah.
Outcost. Okay.
So Outcost is actually everything I mentioned put in masterclass and videos so that every founder can access how to localize their strategy and how to prepare the pitch deck and the sales and how to present well in front of global partners. So the best way now to actually engage and learn more would be to come to Outcost and check our content.
Okay, is this kind of an online video, online education platform, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
In order to apply Outcost, so we can just Google Outcost or how
Yeah,
can we?
you can go outcost.jp. We just made a Japanese version. Basically, it's coming soon because we already on live in Korea, but we're launching for Japan. So you can come to this page, and we are just collecting interest and emails. So whenever we launch, you will receive a special offer and free videos. And also, we are just trying to understand what you want us to launch first. So is it the pitch? Is it POC? Is it how to make your LinkedIn ready for B2B sales, PR, branding, basically? What's the main thing that Japanese founders are looking for? So we can also organize ourselves to launch first what people want first, basically.
Amazing. Is this subscription, right? So how much cost?
So it's basically you can buy the full access to all the masterclass or class by topic. So one topic is around a bit more than $100 for the class. Let's say LinkedIn, like you have a suite of like 10 videos and step-by-step approach, example, best practices. At the end, you have your LinkedIn page ready. So when you contact people, you look very ready for global interactions and basically building trust. Then you have that at the end of the class.
I see. So for example, mastering LinkedIn. So this like online course. So teachers, instructors are all employee of Hack40.
Yes. For now, it's only from Outcost company, but actually we are actively looking for experts in the Japan market. So you said that this podcast might be a way to also ask the audience. So if you know anyone that expertise could help Japanese startup go global outside of what I've just mentioned, then we're happy to have partnership with them and have them as instructors in the platform. So we're looking for instructors who know very well about Japan market. Because it's all about localization from one point to another. So you need to know the one point first to be able to better address the needs in Japan.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I am so curious about your Hack40's history. So could you please tell us why did you start a Hack40?
Yeah, I was actually a student. I randomly ended up working in startups during some internships, and I was like, oh, okay, that's a completely new style of working that is much better fit for me. So during my studies, I started to learn fast new skills that was not taught in the school, like how to use social media for user acquisition and stuff. So actually, it was very useful for startups at the time. In around 2012, 2013 in France, it was a big startup wave. Everyone wanted to create a startup. I was super interested. So I did that, and then I was like, oh, I'd like to actually build something, not just give expertise or do projects. So I built my first company. That was a tech company. And at the same time, I was...
At the time, how old were you? Like 20 or 19?
I was... Oh, thank you for making me feel younger. No, I was 22. Actually.
Super young. Okay, great. 22, you started on company with your friends?
Yes.
How did you meet your co-founders?
My first company co-founder is actually one of my best friends from young age, and we still work together actually.
Oh, beautiful story, so good.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was super fun actually. Actually, I think I was lucky, to be honest, because at how can big companies and older people trust young guys, right? I think it was the first time it was possible because of digital technologies. So there was this kind of feeling that young people, they should know because it's new, it's technology, it's social media. So everyone assumed that young people should know better, which was I was super lucky to be in this context and this time actually. So I really jumped into this opportunity and suddenly started to help very established business and experienced people about what I knew and how it can help them. So to continue the story, I was doing actually a lot of mentorship for startups to share how can you get your first clients and test your traction, your market, without spending much money. At the time, like meta platforms like Facebook or Twitter, you could really get organic growth without spending ads.
Wow.
Yeah, it was actually you could create some groups. You could even the Facebook page at the time could get good traction without investing much. So the model was a bit in the early stage for Meta.
Like before Instagram era.
Yeah.
I see.
Exactly. So that one part. But doing that, I started to expand my expertise in startups and to actually help them in the early stage. So I became a mentor to many acceleration programs. Many big companies were interested in what is this startup wave? Like some people can compete with us now and they are faster than us. So how can we still be number one? Like I'm talking about the biggest company, like banks, telecom and products companies, cosmetics. So they were starting to send the staff and visit the co-working, visit the accelerator, and the staff were like, oh, okay, it looks cool, but then they just come back to the office and nothing can really change. So we thought, how can we really give them the framework they need if they want to innovate as fast as a startup? What it means have an idea very fast and try first, like test and learn, doing a prototype, like a very imperfect version of what you want to do. Let's say a food product, you want to try a new flavor, new packaging, a new retail store concept. So make it small and try to see if there is a good response. If yes, get more funding to invest and grow it. So basically, same as a startup would be looking for funds. Like big companies, innovation programs would prove first and then get internal funds. So we work with the directors and teach them how to invest like a VC, but for internal staff and internal projects.
Smart.
So with my co-founder of Hack40, called Fabrice, we put all the energy in that, and it was really surfing the wave. Like all the companies wanted to do that. We had so many projects, and it was super interesting. It was called at the time intrapreneurship,
Entrepreneurship. I love that.
Yeah, it was entrepreneurship from inside. So we did like internal hackathon programs, and they were like, okay, it's good, but we're two very active and ambitious people. So we thought it would be really interesting to launch a new market. So after thinking, we thought that Asia was the growing market for most of our clients. Usually either they would have an innovation center in Singapore for Asia, for instance, or they would have like a very big growth in North Asia if they were doing more products or cosmetics services. So we opened our office in Singapore 7 years ago, moved there to run the office. At the first, we copy-pasted the model, like doing innovation service for big companies who want to innovate. But after, what's interesting when I arrived in Asia is that once you're in Asia for a company from France or for the US, they're like, oh, you're in Asia, perfect. They don't really care where you are. They're like, oh, we have a project in China, we have a project in Korea. Can you go? Can you help? So because from far away, it looks like you can travel everywhere very fast. So I discovered that actually the travel distance was shrinking, and being on a flight and going next day to China or Korea was very basic in Asia. So I started to do that a lot myself. And we did a lot of projects. After, our last piece of story is after having opened many markets for ourselves and building a really good partnership with big companies, looking for innovation.
Big company in Singapore.
In Singapore and also in China and also in Korea. So then we thought, okay, why don't we use this asset and come back to our first story that was the helping startups, but now not for early stage, but for global scale. So you have a strong business in your market. You already have clients. You are thinking that you can get better growth with a new country opening, and then we opened the global acceleration branch of Hack40. So that's why I said at the beginning we are a global startup accelerator now.
Amazing.
So we started to do government-funded projects with Singapore, with Korea, as I said in the beginning, and now in Japan. And this is so interesting because every part of the program is about helping super good quality products, great founders and great team, but only giving them the very small piece that they need to localize.
Yeah.
So most of the time is like business practice, like how to set a meeting, how to run the meeting, how to negotiate, how to have a chit chat, how to succeed in a networking event, how to generate meetings with global clients. And it's a lot of stories that I've experienced by myself for my own. So it's actually very pragmatic sharing of how those big companies work abroad, which is a completely different system than local market. So like you need to navigate procurement, vendor registration, delivery, upsell. And at the same time, those companies, like it's very hard for them to trust because let's say you're from Japan, I take this example, you want to go to Singapore, like you're far away, you potentially have competition already here in Singapore, so why would we work with someone who is from another country, who we don't know, who have potentially a different language, who doesn't have a local entity in Singapore? So if there is a problem, maybe it's harder to fix it by law, if at worst case, or just negotiating. So actually you start with minus 12 points, minus 15 points, and that's totally normal. And actually when people come to Japan, they also start with minus 15 points. So it's just a fair game, right? We just have to know the rules and play the rules. So to go against that, you need to make extra effort to look more trustworthy.
Yeah.
So what is this effort? This effort is making a lot of your content and your part of your website and your LinkedIn like fully English, that if they search you, they can find, because they think if they are the first one you try to talk to as a global client, then maybe you don't have this practice. But if you already have many global clients, then you know how to work already with them, so they feel more relaxed and comfortable. So that's first. Then you need to sometimes adapt and try to find a really small POC, as I shared, like proof of concept, that would be very easy to test for them. Maybe even for free. Sometimes if you're aggressive sales strategy, you can offer a POC for free. Let's say for one month, we install our product or you test our software, and then we give you a full report. If we prove that we optimized something, then we can go to next step and negotiate for a real contract. And this approach actually is the top recommended approach, global POC, because you will get rid of a lot of friction points to become a real vendor first. But just like, oh, there is an opportunity, it looks interesting, we need it. And you also need to be different. Like maybe you're cheaper, which is pretty hard to do. Maybe you have a technology that is better than what they're using.
Yeah.
So you also need to learn the market. What is your potential customer using? What is the competition? And how can you really prove that you are different? Because you will always have the question as a startup, oh, but we have vendors do it that. What do you do better, right? What do you do different? So if you don't study and do your homework, what they are using, what's the competition there, you cannot answer, and then it doesn't work then.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Sofian. 1. Hack40 finding a unique niche in France startup boom. Sofian launched Hack40 during the early wave of startup in France. Instead of building just another product, he spotted a niche helping Large French corporations adapt startup thinking. Hack40 became a bridge between France's top 40 companies. And agile startup method. Lesson. You don't always need to build the next big app. Sometimes the smartest move is finding a gap in the system and solving it with creativity and focus. 2. Global expansion takes time, patience, and trust. Hack40 successfully expanded into Singapore, Korea, and now Japan. But Sofian says every new market starts with 15 trust points. No reputation, no local entity, no immediate credibility. Building trust takes time and requires deep relationships with local corporate and government. Lesson. You can't rush global success. Focus on listening, adapting, and providing your value with a small POC. Proof of concept. Trust comes from consistent action. 3. Entrepreneurship. Teaching corporates to think like startups. Before becoming a global accelerator, Hack40 trained large corporations to innovate from within. Sofian and his team taught international teams to move like startups. Test fast, learn quickly, and pitch their own ideas internally. Lesson. Even inside a big company, you can think like a founder. Start small, test your idea, show results, and idea innovation from within. Okay? Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Okay? The next episode is the conversation with Sofian part 2. Stay tuned. Okay, bye bye, またね。チャオ。